So good afternoon. I'm Eric Adair, Vice Chair of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. The meeting facilitator is Tara Bravo with CV Strategies. Audio, video, and chat features of this meeting are being recorded, and the meeting is being conducted in accordance with Governor Newsom's Executive Order N2920. To begin, all SAC members and staff are unmuted. Please mute your devices until you are ready to speak and to avoid feedback and background noise. Then unmute yourselves to comment or respond. Members of the public are muted. Video is off upon joining the meeting, but will be unmuted for public comments and questions. I will call for general public comment at item 2. Then again for each agenda item. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. You have 3 options for public comments. The first is you may indicate in the chat feature at any time during the item discussion that you would like to be called upon. You may also write your question or comment in the chat feature itself. Or when public comments are open, Tara will unmute all members of the public. And you may verbally state your name and indicate you have a question or comment and then be recognized to go ahead and speak. Kathy Martin will time each public comment and will advise you when your 3 minutes is up. And then your microphone will be muted after a brief pause. Public comment can also be sent via email or regular mail. Please refer to the agenda for specifics on how to do that. Any public comments received via email or in writing during or after today's meeting will be posted to the website the next day, and that will become part of the public record. Okay, I will introduce each agenda item and the presenter. After each presentation, I will ask the committee for any questions of the presenter. Please indicate you want to comment by using the raise hand feature on Zoom or by otherwise signaling to me that you would like to comment. Please wait until being called upon. If there are many who have questions, I may call on you in alphabetical or other order. Once the committee is done commenting or asking questions of the presenter, I will then call for public comments. The committee may then discuss the item and any public comments. Again, if you wish to comment at that point, please raise your hand or indicate you'd like to speak. Today's PowerPoint was not included in your packet, but I see that it was just circulated before the meeting began, so that should be available to everyone now. Tara, if you're able there, would you please take roll?
Absolutely. Dan Masnada. I see you, Dan.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Roy Marson. Sandra Cattell.
I'm here.
There you go. I was like, I think you're muted. Stacy Fortner.
I'm right here.
Dennis Ostrom.
Here.
Steve Sly.
Here.
Matt Carpenter.
Here.
Eric Adair is here.
Here.
And Holly Schroeder is not here, and that's it.
Thank you, Tara. We now have an opportunity for public comments at the beginning of our meeting. This is item 2 of our agenda. If there are any members of the public who wish to be heard, now would be the time for that. You have 3 minutes. Please indicate either in the comments section or by announcing yourself, and then we will call on you, and then once you're recognized, your 3 minutes will begin. Is there anyone who wishes to make a public comment?
Eric, before we get started on public comment, I would just like to request that we get something like the PowerPoint more than a few minutes before the meeting. You know, I always like to look through things before the meeting. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you. Is there anyone else who has a comment at the beginning of the meeting? Otherwise, we will move to item 3.1 of our agenda, approval of the minutes of the January 12th Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting. Is there anyone who would like to make a motion regarding those minutes? We have a motion from Stacy Fortner. Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Sandy Cattell. Tara, do you want to take a vote, a roll call vote on that?
Absolutely. Dan Masnada,
Yes.
Sandra Cattell,
I'm here. Yes.
Stacy Fortner,
Yes.
Dennis Ostrom,
Yes.
Steve Sly,
Yes.
Matt Carpenter,
Yes.
and Eric Adair.
Yes,
Perfect. Passes.
thank you. Next on our agenda is item 3.2, a presentation by Rick Vergoots on the sustainable management criteria development. Do we have Rick here?
I am here. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Rick.
And we have Tom Barnes from ESA and Jeff Berry that are going to do the lion's share of the work with the presentation today. And Tom is going to share his screen. We've got a fairly lengthy presentation today. It's got quite a few slides on the groundwater surface water issues and less on the groundwater quality issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom and let you get going.
Thanks, Rick. I just realized my background screen was the happy birthday from my kid's party last time I was on Zoom, so sorry about that. I will share the presentation here. Just a second. Okay. And can you see that screen here?
Not yet.
We see you're sharing, but we haven't yet been able to see the PowerPoint.
It's a big file.
Okay.
So let's let it load for a second. It's not responding to me either, so give it a second here and I'll try it again if it doesn't work in a second. Yeah, it seems to have crashed on me, first time all day. We've been in this today. So bear with me and I'll see if I can rectify it. I am having difficulties here. My computer just crashed on me. So can you still hear me?
We can hear you, Tom. I have it on my screen. If I can share it, if that would help you, for me to share it.
It might, but let me try one more
Okay.
time here. I'm back and I'll try one more time. And then we'll see if it works. And then if it doesn't, we'll do that. Eric, thank you.
There you go. Now we see it.
All right. That was a glitch. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. You can see this green and blue slide.
Yes.
Well, I'll just get started then. My name is Tom Barnes with ESA, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present today the material that we've been working on with Rick and GSI together. I have about 45 slides here on depletion of interconnected surface water, so I'll try to clip through it as quickly as I can. There's a lot of material here. Our topics for today in the presentation are really twofold or threefold, including next steps, but the focus is the first bullet, interconnected groundwater and surface water sustainability management criteria. So we really wanted to overview the process of developing criteria for this indicator. We'll start with an overview of the surface and groundwater interaction interconnectedness definitions. and then do a review of the work that we've done on undesirable results, minimum thresholds, and measurable objectives, and then move over to action trigger levels that we are recommending, as well as an evaluation process and potential management action process. I then have a series of hydrographs that we can evaluate across the whole basin, and looking at the different hydrographs in different locations really tells a very interesting story about the variability of access to groundwater and depths to groundwater through the basin, and how much better understanding we're getting as the model is finalized. We then can move at that point to the next topic, which Jeff will present, which is the groundwater quality sustainable management criteria, and he'll go through the process of that as well. So on our plate, let's just get started. You've seen these before, these 3 slides. Jeff has presented these, I think, in the summertime. Just an overview of interconnected surface water and groundwater dynamics. We've got a concept of a gaining stream, which is a surface water flow that is collecting water from the groundwater basin. The water is upwelling into the river, and the river is essentially draining that discharge into its channel. A losing stream then is just the opposite, where the groundwater table is slightly below the surface water, but connected, and the saturated zone connects from the groundwater to the stream, but it's a losing stream nonetheless, where surface water is recharging the groundwater. And then the third sort of concept is a disconnected losing stream, that where the ground is defined here. Firstly, any permanent loss or significant degradation of existing native riparian or aquatic habitat due to lowered groundwater levels caused by pumping. So any permanent loss. The second one is a temporary acute loss of aquatic habitat, since fish really rely on cubic feet per second. Temporary acute loss of aquatic habitat in specific locations that are known to be critical to sensitive aquatic species due to lowered groundwater levels caused by pumping. Those are the 2 significant and undesirable effects to groundwater dependent ecosystems that we're wanting to avoid. So in establishing minimum thresholds to get to that protection, we really focused on the groundwater. That minimum thresholds would be levels of groundwater that avoid significant effects to groundwater dependent ecosystems. The existing GDEs that are in the basin have been resilient through historic droughts. And the recent drought from 2014 to 2017 in that area was an historic drought. It was a time when many of the locations that we have modeled reached their lowest depths. And so what we see right now, from the greenness of the corridor and the vitality of the GDEs, has survived through that historic period, and the groundwater has been sustaining them. In our research, it's clear that groundwater levels are highly variable across the basin. There are variables seasonally in particular, and then in locations, as we can tell, and we'll go through today in some hydrographs, across the basin, they change substantially. And the whole basin drains and tilts towards the west, and so the elevation drop is considerable. So to determine a minimum threshold of groundwater depth, it really depends on the specific location. And so we'll use historic low groundwater levels as a trigger for management actions to avoid significant effects. But those low groundwater levels, the historic lows, would really need to be attributed to specific locations. Our recommendation for action trigger levels is here. The last bullet, groundwater levels within GDE areas that fall below the lowest historical depth within the previous 40 years. We have that 40-year period because it captures a nice hydrologic period and doesn't include some of the older hydrographs in the 50s, where there were a few years where groundwater levels were dropped substantially. So we don't want to include those, but the more recent historic drops. Sigma also then requires and establish a measurable objective for depletion of interconnected surface water. And so we're identifying the following for that: average future groundwater levels that do not result in permanent loss of habitat at monitoring locations within the GD areas. So we get to this average level, which is the measurable objective. We also want to maintain flow in the river needed to sustain aquatic habitat where UTS are present. And we're really focusing on the area near I-5 bridge. There's an area that has historically sustained surface water flow from upwelling of groundwater, and that is a particularly important aquatic habitat that needs to be protected. This is a schematic that we derived from the TNC, the Nature Conservancy, the TNC guidelines for evaluating impacts to GDEs. Their version is a little bit different, but we changed these lines to more accurately reflect what's happening in this basin. And it's divided into the left into the historic variability and the current variability. And you can see that on an annual basis, this groundwater basin really uniformly has substantial ups and downs. There are most, if not all locations, respond dramatically to winter storms, and recharge is clear in the alluvial aquifer. It then drops down into the dry season, and we consider the late dry season or September period to be generally the low period in most groundwater levels. In this period here, and that's in orange, we really did experience the low, and you'll see that in the hydrographs when we get to them. In this graphic, we've got a range and an average line going through the lines into the future, into the hydrograph, into the future. And that average really corresponds to our measurable objective. We really see that the basin has been managed sustainably, working through substantial recoveries, hovering around an average point for many years. And we consider that is likely to be the case into the future. We do have identified the low level here, which is the historic low, and we're calling that the management trigger level or the action trigger level. And if that level is reached in any of our monitoring locations in the future, we'd want to go through an evaluation process as to why that level was reached, what's the cause of it, and does the indication of the lower than historic levels, could that result in a significant and unreasonable effect, which includes permanent loss or temporary acute loss of aquatic habitat in specific places. So when that trigger level is reached, what do you do? What happens then? What will the monitoring plan need to include in it? And we've done some thinking about that and have some thoughts and some questions to answer as an evaluation in real time when data comes in that a monitoring well has reached an historic low. Firstly, is the river sediment supported by surface flow from WRP discharges in this area? We'll walk through some of the hydrographs and see that surface water from the WRPs is influential for both aquatic and riparian habitat in the corridor. Secondly, is the historic low groundwater level already below the tree or shrub root depths? In other words, if we're already 20 feet below ground surface or 30 feet, an additional increment may not be meaningful to vegetation at the surface. And then will the vegetation and sensitive species survive the temporary loss of access to groundwater? And that is a qualitative measure to see if perhaps a groundwater level is reached in October, but the indication from a riparian effect is not substantial. And we know that the winter will bring levels right back up, and perhaps they'll be able to survive that variability, which is a natural process. An evaluation point. The next point is, has this trigger been reached often in recent years, and are we subject to potentially chronic stress, or have the levels recovered quickly every year? Also, are the declines in groundwater levels resulting from pumping? A big distinction from just a drought signature. And finally, I think there's room for new information obtained in the future that might refine these trigger levels. And so these are some of the thoughts of evaluating when a trigger level is reached. However, this last point here it remains important that if the potential for a significant and unreasonable effect to GDEs is apparent, it's timely management actions are important to be implemented that may include reduced pumping if necessary to protect the GDEs. Okay, so I'm going to do more about the considerations of evaluating effects to GDEs and sort of provide a survey of the basin and some of the relationships that we're seeing with the groundwater hydrographs. Firstly, to start out with the potential groundwater dependent ecosystem map that we presented this summer. This is a shot of that map. It was still potential because we had done the first step of the TNC guidelines, which is to really follow the vegetation signature. We really existing databases identifying riparian and oak woodland habitat that might be sustained by groundwater shallow saturated soils, and really followed the signature of the vegetation at the surface. We had not at this point identified depth to groundwater as an indicator here or a restriction. But we have done that now, and this map shows the difference. And I'll toggle back a couple times on this. This map shows where groundwater is 30 feet below the ground, any vegetation at the surface that were potentially GDEs identified previously have been removed. So I'll go back to this potential GDE map, and you can see some oak woodlands in the north, some oak woodlands in the south that have been removed since the groundwater is showing 30 feet below ground surface in these areas. And 30 feet is a very conservative low depth for these types of vegetation, where 5, 10, 15 feet is starting to get stressed, and 30 is a pretty comfortable distance to recognize that any vegetation on the surface is unable to access saturated soils. Now we chose this point as September 2011, and 2011 was a pretty wet year, and September is the drier part of the year. So the logic there is for a groundwater dependent ecosystem to survive, they would need access to groundwater over a period of time without large gaps. And so they'd have to be able to be sustained through the dry period. So we picked that dry period as an appropriate measure. And 2011 is a wet year, and so we are looking at a conservative view here. I'm going to step through some points on the river and show hydrographs in these points. We've provided this table as an example of what could go into a monitoring plan. It may not, these points may or may not ultimately make the monitoring plan, but they are a good indication of where we'll likely want to know. And there's reasons why, because of the variability that will be expressed here. So I'm going to step through this. This table is included in the materials, and it shows some examples of depth to groundwater below the thalweg, river thalweg, which is the low flow channel essentially. And this map shows the locations on that table and what could turn into monitoring locations or near monitoring locations. After I've gone through these dots, I'll also do some more on the eastern side. I've brought some more hydrographs on the eastern side of the basin in response to some comments that we've received in the last couple of meetings. I want to make sure that we provide a good look at the eastern side as well. So starting out right here at the mouth of the San Francisco Canyon, just below that canyon, this blue arrow indicates where this hydrograph is from. I'll explain the hydrograph. The squiggly blue line is the simulated, modeled historic groundwater level. So this is the level that the model finds for this point, and the model has been calibrated to other points in the basin. And it shows the green line here is the average, and that would be essentially the measurable objective. This red line then is indicating the action trigger for the historic low. And you can see that in 2014, this particular point at the mouth of the San Francisco Creek reached a low point historically. It's hard to see on this graph. It'll be easier on the next couple graphs, but there's a dashed green line right underneath this red line. That indicates the estimated depth of the channel itself. So that's the low flow channel elevation. So at this particular place, right there at the confluence, we're seeing groundwater levels that are 2 feet higher than the bottom of the channel almost always. And at one point it got really close to being right at the channel depth. We've prepared some of these schematic graphics to kind of get a better sense of what that might really look like. And this is an example in this location where the channel is pretty wide, but there's a low flow aspect to it. And in that low flow area, the willows in particular are thrive in this area. The light blue indicates the average, maybe the measurable objective for this particular spot, whereas the dark blue would represent the historic low. And in this location, the historic low has always been right at the edge of the thalweg, still providing some moisture there, still sustaining this habitat vegetation that's crowded around the low flow channel like a ribbon. In this area of this channel, there's some sandbar indicated in the middle. And then on the other side, there is a wider stretch of trees. And those trees may get stressed in low flow. I mean, not flow, low groundwater levels. So that in periods when the groundwater does dip, these trees are subject to stress and could experience some die-off. And but that groundwater level does come back up, and if you maintain a measurable objective level over time, this area is a sustained ecosystem. I wanted to show this graphic, which is right where we were talking about, the confluence of the San Francisco Creek coming down and into the confluence of the Santa Clara River. Here's the I-5, and then this bridge here is a McBean Parkway. And you can really see the signature here of a dry channel to the east with river wash scrub and a sandbar slowly becoming more green and more influenced by an upwelling of groundwater until the channel narrows, and under I-5 bridge, it becomes a very dense forest. When we look at aerial photographs from 47 and from 59, we really see this same pattern where a very dry channel turns right at this location into an expression of riparian growth. And in fact, our current photos here from Google Earth really show a stronger green signature of all of the historic photographs, but it's a similar type of situation, reflecting that the greenness, the vegetation, the habitat in this segment has been sustained for 50 or 60, 70 years, at least. Moving down the river, one dot here to the I-5 bridge itself, we can see again, the squiggly line is this modeled, simulated, historic groundwater level with a dip in 2014. That would be the action level here on this particular point. The green line, the light green line, is the measurable objective. This dark green line is a bank indicator of elevation. So this groundwater level is substantially above the dashed line down here, which is the bottom of the thalweg. The scale here is in 1 or 2 feet. And so it's about this red line is about 5 feet above the estimated channel depth. There are some elevational estimates going on here. We know at this point that the aquatic habitat provided in this low flow channel at the I-5 bridge is critical and needs to be maintained as much as possible. And so we see here that in using the historic levels as in a schematic, that the dark blue has maintained its connection with the thalweg. The light blue is generally an average that's higher. But you can see that in 2014, when it dipped down in this area to below to its lowest point, in this area, it's a narrow channel, and there's a benching that happens, and there's some cottonwood trees in this benching, and those cottonwood trees were affected by that low groundwater moment. That groundwater came back and needs to be managed at the measurable objective level, and those cottonwood forests and individual trees can reemerge and revegetate in those banks. I'll move down, skip a few, but I'll move down to a drier part of the river, a losing reach of the river. And so in this one, you can see the dashed line is here above the historic hydrograph as the bottom of the channel, and averaging about 7 or 8 feet. The lowest it reached was 15 feet below the channel in about 2017. Now, 15 feet is really reaching the limits of the larger trees out there, and the willows, only very mature willows might be able to reach that. But only mature willows might be able to reach even the 7 or 8 feet depth. So when you look at the vegetation out here, and I'll show pictures from the Google Earth, you can really see that there's most of the greenness is hugging like a ribbon, a green ribbon hugging the low flow channel. And it seems that surface water could very well be a sustaining influence in this particular stretch. We have a large sandbar in this area, and it's at an average times, that sandbar is really is too high in elevation to reach groundwater. And then the dark blue shows that certainly when the groundwater has dipped in the past, it's too deep to sustain vegetation. This is showing the channel variability in this very location. On the right is just below the VW, the Valencia discharge. You see a thick green forest here that has indications of groundwater upwelling as well as surface water. But when you get a little farther down, you see that there's a big wide sandbar. The green is narrowing and attaching itself to the low flow channel more often. Some scrub vegetation is coming in on the sandbars. And this just gives you a little bit closer view so that groundwater has less influence in these areas, but it's complicated. Okay, then moving to the end of the basin, the Potrero Canyon area, this really shows a rising groundwater farther down the channel. In fact, this signature is shown for much of this of the reach after this Castaic Creek all the way to Ventura. Essentially, although there's some variability there, this shows the dashed green line being below the historic groundwater levels, and so this action trigger would be above that channel. And again, this schematic is showing that concept, with the bank providing substantial moisture, generally, most often, to the vegetation. I'm going to shift now and focus on the eastern part of the basin. I think there's a lot of interest in that, and so we've done the same sort of evaluations here, starting with Placerita Creek. I think last week, the last committee meeting, there was a concern about potential stress to vegetation and die-off in the Placerita Canyon area. So this hydrograph shows that area, and indeed it shows that groundwater is within 5, 10 feet, and then in 2017 reached a nadir of 13 feet approximately. Again, these are estimates, but you can see that the trend, that indeed in 2017 groundwater levels dropped to their historic lows, and enough to create some stress in the cottonwood forest and the oak trees potentially in that area as well. So this segment of Placerita Canyon is still within the 30-foot cliff. So we're still looking at this area as a potential GDE. But looking at the signature, it's clear that this area is fed by storms. And every time it rains, it gets a boost. And when it doesn't rain, it just continues to lower. And so, you know, it was about 8 years of, or 7 years of decline where there just wasn't enough rain to give the boost to that edge of the groundwater basin, the very outer edge of the groundwater basin. It's unlikely that pumping is a part of this trend, but that would be something the monitoring plan would need to evaluate. I'll do another one here that is farther upstream, right at the Bouquet Canyon confluence. And again, we see tremendous variability here. We're getting to a low of 42 feet in 2014, and just generally being about 20 feet below the ground, the surface of the thalweg. So any vegetation in that area is unlikely to be connected with the groundwater, either on an average or in a low level condition. And I just provided this graphic to kind of give a sense of what's happening in that location. There are surface water sources here that are creating a green signature and a riparian signature. And so the Saugus WRP is located here and discharges right here, and you can really clearly see the effect of that. And then this is Bow Creek concrete channel that drains urban runoff into this area. And there's a nice little forebay here of vegetation that has come up as a result. You don't see this in the historic photographs of 47, but it's here now. Otherwise, it's a very dry area. So the relationship with groundwater in this area is not very strong. We'll go over to San Francisco Creek now and up a little ways. And in our 30-foot depth criterion that we added to the GDE map, we still have some signature of GDEs here on the San Francisco Creek. And this is the hydrograph that's shown there, reaching a low in 2016 of 42 feet after a series of a drought years. This is a complicated spot. It seems to get water at the channel level for some years that's rather substantial. And you'd think that during subsequent or repetitive wet years, you might see some emerging vegetation. You might see some willows cropping up and other types of riparian habitat. And then you go through stretches of 3 or 4 years where you get 20 feet, 15, 20 feet of a drop. And you just wonder if they could sustain that. And so you kind of see that signature in the channel itself with stressed vegetation. And then the historic hydrographs a little farther down in this creek, you see a stronger indication of green habitat and much less so as you go up the creek. Okay, a few more here. This would be the South Fork above the confluence. And we show here a substantial depth, 60 feet below the thalweg. So it's pretty clear that this is not connected to groundwater. And I think the vegetation signature is pretty clear in this one spot. There are spots closer to the Santa Clara River that might have a little closer connection, but in this point, it's clear that this is not contributing to surface vegetation. All right, now I'm going to start from the back. I've got about four more of these, and then I'm done. So I'm at the eastern end here, and I'll sort of march down the channel to the west. So starting on the east end of the basin, there is a little a GDE out there, or there's some vegetation, I should say, out there. And you can see a very interesting signature. And this is really resulting from discharge of the basin to the east, which comes out of a canyon area and is perennially a groundwater dependent ecosystem from the weather patterns in the watershed. And it discharges into our basin and then drops immediately into the groundwater basin. So you can see that during the wet times every year, it flows strong and then it drops, flows strong and then it drops. And this is a 20-foot drop. Every year a 20-foot drop. in this most recent drought, we had a nice 7-year period of really, 50 feet. And so although there are an expression of willow trees in this area, they are clearly being watered from the discharge on the from the upper watershed. And then moving down the channel, Pine Tree. This we're shifting away from the simulated model to the actual data. We've got some data here in a well that is these blue dots, and so you can see substantial variability. These are 10-foot increments, so you can see over time substantial drawdown, very strong recovery at certain periods, and then strong drawdowns. So the likelihood that there's any groundwater dependent ecosystems in this part of the channel is very, very low. Just seeing how deep this groundwater can get, and how seldom it gets a chance, the vegetation gets a chance to emerge. Okay, down to Sand Canyon, same signature. Closer to this to the channel bottom at times, perhaps, maybe more interesting for emerging vegetation, but again, withering drought periods that would eliminate sustainability of a vegetation there in this area. And that's true in the historic photographs. And then again, similarly, a little bit farther down, same pattern. Depth down to 90 feet at times. Recovery is possible, but it really drops down substantially. And again, pretty significant, or pretty similar to the 47 and 59 aerial photographs that we've witnessed. No, really very little vegetation in this area. And then my final hydrograph is here. And similar, although expressing some elevated levels during some periods, again, that might encourage a habitat emergence in these 3 years, and then it wouldn't be sustained. So part of the understanding of an action trigger is what we expect to be sustained and what we don't. And in this area, with the history of such low drops, we really don't think that this vegetation in this area is something that we're going to see in the future. And again, similar to the historic photographs. That concludes my part of the presentation, and I'll stop sharing and send it back to Rick and Jeff.
Thanks, Tom. And Jeff is working remotely with the power outage. Maybe we may need you to advance those slides for Jeff.
Yeah.
Jeff, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was wondering, perhaps, do you want to take any questions now regarding what was just presented, or do you want to wait till the end?
I'll leave it up to our chair.
We have a hand raised. Why don't we go ahead? Let's take committee comments at this point. We'll hold public comment till the end of the full presentation. But if there are those on the committee who want to make comments right now, that'd be fine. Unless Mr. Bunn instructs me that that is not okay, that's what we'll do.
No, that's fine.
Okay. Ms. Cattell, you have a comment.
Well, thank you. I have a whole bunch of comments. Thank you for addressing the East Side. This is the first time I've seen anybody addressing the East Side. So I'd like to mention that, my appreciation. I don't think it's only pumping that we need to think about. I think we need to think about removing some of the invasive species that suck up our water, like the ailanthus and the arundo. They really are taking a lot of our water. Also, our sanitation districts, the water reclamation plants do add water to the river, but they're adding it in central and western area. I know they're going to have a new sanitation district or a new sanitation district facility with the project right now at Sand Canyon. But is it possible that we could potentially encourage, as part of a solution, instead of pumping sanitation discharge upriver, that we would have a new sanitation district facility on the east end? I mean, there's been a lot of development on the east end. I looked at what you were saying about Placerita Creek, and the creek does run across the back of my property. I have seen a lot less water coming through here. But when the water comes through, it comes through faster and it has been channeled. So there is less infiltration because of the speed of the flow, just sends it out. Also, in Bouquet Creek, you talked about that. There's a lot of Arundo up there. San Francisco Creek, you talked about the lows. There's a lot of Arundo there. The South Fork at a negative 60 feet. Remember, that's been channeled. That's water that runs down a lot faster. I've been here long enough to see that South Fork having water a much longer time during the year. And not just in the drought of the last 7 years, but 10 years ago and 15 years ago, it was quite different than it was, say, 40 years ago. When you talk about the Lang Station area, Pine Tree, Sand Canyon, I don't know if there have really been, if it's so much the pumping that has caused this as the change in our climate and the amount of water that we've had, or if perhaps we should start thinking about some of the things of the way we manage the river. Now, those areas in particular make me think of our stormwater capture projects, and those are truly the prime areas that we should be working with the Safe Clean Water projects and get some projects there to get much more infiltration on the east side. And I think we as a GSA should be advocating for that. An additional byproduct of that is if we had a sanitation district facility out that way, we would actually be creating more riparian habitat along the river, and that's always a plus for the animals out here and the plants. Thank you.
Hey, Eric.
Mr. Masnada, go ahead.
Hi. Just a couple of additional thoughts to add to what Sandra was just talking about. I know the county's looked at various stormwater recapture projects, and those, to the extent that there's any viability, would happen downstream. The problem with trying to do it upstream is the gradient is too steep. And in order to capture enough water and spread it, the facilities would be too high, and you need more area, and you'd want to do it in an area where there's more water. At the upstream ends, certainly there's some water, but it increases as you go further to the west. And then staff can speak to this, but as far as sanitation district discharge, that's why the water reclamation plants are on the west end. It's all due to gravity. It all flows down there. You need sufficient volume in order to treat and spread. And then there's also the issue of contact time with respect to producing wells in the vicinity. So not to put a damper on the proposed proposal, but that's something that staff, I think, can respond to. But that was my immediate reaction as far as trying to get reclaimed or recycled water, treated wastewater on the east end. Thanks.
Anyone else before we turn it over to Mr. Barry? We will have public comment at the conclusion of the entire presentation. Seeing and hearing nothing, Mr. Barry, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. All right, well, I've got probably 5 slides to cover degradation of groundwater quality as an indicator of sustainability, and I'm going to walk through a similar process for setting sustainable management criteria that we've been using for the other indicators. So the first thing is, and could you go to the next slide, Tom?
Example indicators, or the next one?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I can't see your screen, but that's the next one, I think. Example indicators.
Yep.
Yeah, example indicators of undesirable results. Now, it's important to note that we're interested in ensuring that all beneficial uses have good quality water, at least making sure that the quality doesn't get any worse. And that includes municipal, private wells, domestic wells, agricultural wells. So the criterion that you see here, the undesirable results that we've come up with here are intended to represent the full range of beneficial uses. So I'll just go through them briefly. And these would be evaluated at representative wells, representative monitoring sites, they're called. So first, water management actions that interfere with existing groundwater remediation efforts, creating a permanent loss of groundwater supply. Now this one happens to show up that interfering with existing groundwater remediation efforts is one that DWR expects to see in basins that have existing contamination. Another undesirable result would be concentrations of these regulated contaminants like perchlorate, VOCs, et cetera, in untreated groundwater from private, domestic, or agricultural wells exceed regulatory thresholds, and I'll talk more about those regulatory thresholds in a minute. Significant and unreasonable loss of municipal groundwater supply due to migration of contaminant plume, and an inability to pump and treat groundwater or reasonably secure an alternative water supply. And lastly, groundwater pumping strategies that cause concentrations of salts and nutrients, that's total dissolved solids, a measure of salt content, chloride, nitrate, and sulfate, which have been identified as constituents of concern in this basin from past studies, exceeding water quality objectives. And ultimately, the basin-wide assimilative capacity described in salt and nutrient management plan. Now, there's a lot of technological terms in there, but basically basin-wide assimilative capacity has been determined in that salt and nutrient management plan in a number of zones, and I'm going to talk more about that also. Moving to the next slide, Tom, the map.
Yep, got it.
Great. So this map shows basically all of the alluvial wells that we know of, both production wells, agricultural wells, and monitoring wells. They're in yellow. We have a number of other wells in green, these green dots. Those are Saugus production wells mostly, and a few monitoring locations. And then we've identified some other locations here that we're considering as representative monitoring sites as we are beginning the development of the monitoring plan. And I've shown here in kind of a purple color those that are associated with the alluvial aquifer, and then in the blue are those that are associated with the Saugus Formation. And we're going to be, in the next several weeks, we're going to be working on this monitoring plan and establishing this monitoring network for evaluating both water levels and water quality, and as well as the other sustainability indicators. Just wanted to kind of show you where we're headed. Next slide.
Okay.
So we've talked about minimum thresholds for the other indicators. So now let's talk about them for groundwater quality degradation. We've got 2 kinds of thresholds that we're considering, and we'd like your input on this. So we've established some thresholds for contaminants, first, and the second being salts and nutrients. So for contaminants, those include perchlorate, VOCs, PFAS, that have been detected in several wells over many years in the basin, which predates enactment of SGMA in January of 2015. And the reason I point this out is essentially DWR wants to make sure that we're just not going to make conditions worse. So there's a bit of an acceptance of what's there, and let's do our best to try not to make things worse and work with the regulatory agencies to try to improve groundwater quality conditions for contaminants. And so it's the responsibility for the characterization, monitoring, remediation, that's being handled by the State Regional Water Quality Control Board and the California Department of Toxic Substance Control. Their responsibility for those things, not the GSA. SCV Water has continued to proactively collaborate with these regulatory agencies, monitored the contamination, and they've installed a number of wellhead treatment facilities when contamination concentrations have approached regulatory thresholds. And because the GSA has no authority or responsibility for managing the contamination, we've not set any minimum thresholds for these regulated contaminants. Just wanted to be clear about that. Let's see. Moving to the next slide, please, Tom.
Okay.
So proposed minimum thresholds for the degradation of groundwater quality with respect to salts and nutrients. And again, this is TDS, the salt concentration, chloride, nitrate, sulfate. We'd like to propose that the concentrations of these constituents, these salt constituents, measured in 20% of the representative wells within a management zone, when they exceed the water quality objectives for that management zone and the basin-wide assimilative capacity described in the salt nutrient management plan, we'd like to consider those conditions as representing our minimum thresholds. Let me get into that in a little more detail just to kind of give you a sense for what I'm talking about. So next slide, Tom.
Yep.
So the basin plan, the state, has come up with, and the Regional Water Quality Control Board has developed this water quality control plan. And within the plan, there are a number of water quality standards for these selected constituents. So you see the salts and nutrients here listed first. So those are the basin plan standards. Those are essentially water quality standards that are protective of drinking water. And then likewise, they have standards listed for the contaminants that we've seen in the basin, perchlorate, PCE, TCE, and the PFAS. These are standards that kind of are thresholds that the regulatory agencies are paying attention to, and certainly SCV Water is paying attention to with respect to drinking water. Now, we also have a set of standards. If you go to the next slide, Tom.
Yep.
We have a set of standards that have been, this is a table showing both ambient water quality in different zones within the basin, management zones. They're listed 1A to 6. And there are water quality objectives for each of those constituents that I mentioned, the salts and nutrients. These have been established in that salt and nutrient management plan within each of those zones. And they vary. These water quality objectives vary in each of these zones. And basically it was, the salt nutrient management plan provides a basis for understanding how much additional salt loading can that zone within the basin accept when it comes to development of a new project? And are there projects that can be implemented that would actually improve water quality and allow more room to be able to allow salts or nutrients into that segment of the basin or that zone in the basin? So these are standards that are set for not only drinking water, but also for for protection of agricultural uses. Now, if we go to the next slide, Tom, it's a map.
Yep.
Okay, this map of the basin, you're probably getting pretty familiar with that kind of spider web pattern. The blue, overall blue pattern is the basin boundary or the basin itself, and then you see these different colors for different segments of the alluvial aquifer within the basins. So the blue color is representative of the Saugus Formation overall, and then sitting on top of the Saugus Formation is this spidery looking multiple colored zones within the alluvium, and each color represents a different zone, as you can see. So management zone 1 is the Mint Canyon zone. You can see that purple area to the right. And then if you go over to the left side, you've got management zone 5, which is referred to as Castaic Valley, and it continues out to the basin boundary or basin outlet to the west. So each of those management zones has a different water quality objective, has a different ambient concentration of these salts and nutrients. And so the monitoring program that we're planning includes representative monitoring wells in each of these management zones, and the plan will include sampling for those constituents to basically document what's going on. All right, so next slide, please.
Yep.
Now, moving on to measurable objectives. Now, just as a reminder, the measurable objectives are kind of an idealized or a target for where we'd like to see the water quality in the future. So these are statements that reflect that. We want to maintain municipal pumping for beneficial uses consistent with the volumes quantified in the Urban Water Management Plan for wet, normal, and dry or multi-dry years. We want to maintain non-municipal pumping, including for private, domestic, golf courses, agricultural users, as well as contaminant remediation pumping consistent with volumes quantified in that Urban Water Management Plan for those wet, normal, dry cycles. And then lastly, we want to see groundwater quality at private wells, private domestic wells that either meet or are better quality than the basin plan objectives in those basin plan water quality standards. And at this point in time, we have very little information about the quality of groundwater that's pumped from private wells. And so we're going to be interested in trying to identify some private wells throughout the basin, some particularly domestic wells used for drinking water that we could use to if the owners are willing to allow us to sample those wells and establish essentially a baseline of what the water quality is, so that with the idea of not wanting it to get any worse. And it allows us to identify if we have any particular problems at private wells, domestic wells in different parts of the basin. So that's our measurable objective for contaminants affecting water quality. If we go to the next slide.
Yep.
We have a measurable objective for salts and nutrients, okay? And basically we're just saying we want those concentrations in any of the wells to meet water quality objectives. And basin-wide assimilative capacity as described in that salt and nutrient management plan. That's our goal. So with that, I'm ready to move on to the next steps, but I'll cover this briefly and then we can go back and I can answer questions on the preceding slides. So this obviously is not going to be the first time that you see all this. We're drafting that sustainable management criteria section of the GSP, and it's going to be ready for your review and distributed on February 10th. There's going to be a SAC meeting on February 24th to discuss the draft SMC section and get some more input. After that, there'll be a public workshop and a GSA board meeting on SMCs. That's March 10th. And then we've got a follow-up meeting with the SAC, which is a debrief following that workshop on March 24th. So you're going to have multiple bites at the apple on this and try to digest it all. It's a fairly detailed, lengthy section. So consider today's presentation and the ones we've had previously as just kind of overviews. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about water quality, or certainly we can go back and talk about depletion of surface water and GDEs.
Let me ask you this. This is Eric. Are we, is the entire presentation now complete, Mr. Vergoots?
Yes.
Or anything else? Okay, terrific. Thank you all very much. That was very informative and helpful. Let's take a minute for anyone on the committee who has comments or questions for our presenters today. I don't see any comments in the chat section.
I've got some comments from the public, so just whenever you're ready.
Okay. Before I turn it over to the public, are there any committee members who have comments or questions?
Eric, this is Matt Carpenter.
Go ahead, Matt.
I've got a question just about how, with respect to the thresholds, how we're connecting the GSA's activities with the thresholds. You know, kind of are the GSA activities causing the threshold to be exceeded? And is that tied into how these thresholds are being factored? As opposed to there's just a level that nobody wants it to go to, but is it due to the GSA's activities as opposed to prolonged drought or something else?
Yeah, great question.
That? Thanks.
Yes, definitely. So number one, and perhaps I neglected to emphasize this, the conditions that we might see out there with respect to water quality are, and our consideration with what to do about it is really driven by a couple things. One, is it caused by pumping? That's the DWR criterion. And secondly, is it caused by drought conditions or low water level conditions? That's part of this. And then lastly, is there an activity, or a project or management action that was proposed in the GSP or implemented in the future by the GSA that potentially is impacting water quality and causing a water quality problem? I'll give you a few examples. So for example, if the GSA wanted to sponsor a recharge project or an injection project somewhere, and the recharge project had the potential to mobilize contaminants that had been identified previously. And that would be a case where the GSA would have some responsibility to manage that situation so that we don't have undesirable results. So it's essentially going to be one of the criterion that now has to be considered. Are you going to move a plume, or are you going to exacerbate a groundwater contamination problem through development of a project through the GSA? So I don't know if did I answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Jeff.
Eric?
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it'd be appropriate for Jeff to explain just in a few minutes, why the salt and nutrient management plan was developed. He's kind of explained its relevance to the water quality objectives, but it was a pretty major effort, and at least to provide the committee a little bit of background on that, so they both understand. Well, they certainly understand. Well, so they understand its relevance as well as its importance to this particular effort. Does that make sense, Jeff?
Yeah, sure, Dan. Let me cover it, and then if I miss any part of it, others can certainly fill in the gaps here. So basically, this was a statewide requirement of virtually all basins to develop these plans. They were intended to be inclusive of all the available data, water quality data within the basin, and so that the existing quality could be established. And then basically the reason that they did these plans is so that those who are proposing projects, let's say that's a recharge project with treated wastewater, or it's some other kind of project that involves development that might have a salt load associated with it. The question is that where that project is being planned, is there a capacity for that groundwater system to accept additional salt loading without exceeding the water quality objective in that particular management zone? And the other reason that this was established was to basically try to encourage projects that would ultimately dilute and reduce the ambient concentration of salts in the groundwater system. Now we've seen, and it's particularly a problem in arid, Southern California areas where salt accumulation is a problem, and it has been identified as a potential problem in this basin. So these kinds of criterion, these water quality objectives were intended to try to not make things worse, and then encourage projects to try to improve things so that beneficial uses, whether that's drinking water or agricultural uses, can be optimized and not compromised by poor quality water with respect to salts and nutrients. I don't know if there was anybody else has, Dan or Rick, anything else you want to add to that?
I think that's good, Jeff. The plans include projects to help take salt loading out, such as the local plan in Santa Clarita includes projects like water conservation and the sanitation district's chloride removal projects that will help reduce salt loading to the basin. And the plans include that to make it, to allow the basin to have a little bit more assimilative capacity for future recycled water projects. So it all sort of works together. So yeah, that's all I have, Jeff.
Good explanation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments from committee members? Hearing nothing. Tara, you had some submitted comments from the public.
I do indeed.
We can address those now and then open it up for anybody else who may wish to publicly comment.
So this question is for Tom Barnes, but I'm sure Jeff can provide some additional insight as well, should he have any. Would you confirm my understanding from the presentation to answer a question? The GDEs around the I-5 bridge are influenced by a combination of naturally high GW levels, or groundwater levels, obviously, and the sand plant. The GDE west of Bouquet Bridge seemed to be influenced by the sanitation plant, but I heard that this historically was not a very green area, meaning that the main influence there is the sand plant. FYI, there is noticeable urban slobber or runoff around from the housing tract along the South Fork that seems to result in the greening of that area. Would increased water use efficiency, less slobber, and or increased recycled water use be something of a conflict with maintaining GDEs in these areas? How would that be resolved going forward? Where is the line between groundwater pumping and other water related things that may affect local GDEs? What is the role of GSP and the project proponents or SCV water? Lots of questions, but they're all kind of interconnected.
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. I appreciate the question. I think that there's a real clear historic signature, as I'm calling it, at this particular location, just where San Francisco Creek confluences with the Santa Clara River, going for about 1,000 feet, maybe 2,000 feet. And that area is historically been an upwelling area, enough to create an aquatic habitat of some interest and value for sensitive species, quite substantially so. It begins to, in the historic footprint, it begins to decline as it heads westward. And at that point, we now have the Valencia WRP at that point that introduces most of the wastewater at that point below this critical recharge area. This critical recharge area, this critical part of the I-5 bridge is downstream of the Saugus, but you can see in that picture that I showed that Saugus vegetation expression dies down, and we have what we sometimes call this McBean dry gap that does separate the perennially supportive area under the I-5 bridge and near that location. So it seems to be quite resilient, and I appreciate that urban runoff does introduce water into the groundwater basin, but the groundwater basin is vast, and the influence of it in terms of the volume that would represent groundwater levels, I think is hard to determine, and so it's a fair point that that's something to evaluate. But we try to outline steps towards evaluating how other factors could be causing this situation when we get near a trigger level. But I think that what we are really beginning to recognize, I think, is that this area has been resilient for 70 years. And so it seems to be a place that even without urban runoff, you tend to naturally see upwelling, and even in pretty dry periods.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
I'll just come if it's okay. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Yeah. We certainly can.
I guess that explains a lot. Can you clarify? So did I hear you say basically that it will be in the GSP documents how we evaluate the cause of a trigger level being hit at that time? Like we're not evaluating it now, we're just setting the trigger level, but we're not evaluating whether it's strictly caused by the GSP or caused by something else. Is that a correct understanding?
Well, there's a long record of a historical hydrological record, and the model is really helpful. It's a simulated model, but it's calibrated to the basin to really target areas. And with that model, we've identified points that would probably be good to include in the monitoring plan. And those points will have a more calibrated historic low that would substantiate GDEs being sustained by that level. Anything below that level, then the plan needs to outline the evaluation process. That evaluation process has to happen pretty quickly because particularly for aquatic habitat, you don't want the river to dry up one season because the fish wouldn't have anywhere to go in that particular location. So, but that evaluation process is really specific to every location. It's got to be different. So I think that we've tried to outline a process for that evaluation.
Let me ask the reverse question to see if that's more clear. So I saw your points about depth to groundwater, right? Is basically the driving factor. If we have an area like along the South Fork that dies because the housing tract is now so efficient with water use that there's no more runoff, is the GSP responsible for that or
No.
not? Because that's not an issue, not an area where you said that groundwater was a factor. So if we see vegetated areas dying that are not groundwater influenced, does a GSA, GSP have any obligation, or do we just say, well, that was never a groundwater factor in that area? So, not something we're going to be concerned with.
Yeah, I think that's the case. This is
Okay.
a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act organization, and we are concerned with groundwater and so surface water infiltration, and then the stormwater project or the project that captures that and strands any vegetation in a stream is not of the concern.
Okay, that is very helpful. And if I can, yeah, so that also, I had a follow up to Matt's question too about, so again, similarly, if we see tons of trees dying because it's, 5 degrees hotter, summers are longer, 20 years from now, if that groundwater doesn't drop, again, it's not something that we have to worry about.
That's correct. I mean, I'll just say that again, groundwater dependent ecosystems is about consistent access to saturated soils. And to the extent that climate changes that in the future, there's nothing that the GSA can necessarily do about that.
Okay.
We have experienced long droughts. Perhaps 15 years ago, we wouldn't have anticipated the drought we just went through. But nonetheless, there's nothing that can be done about that. And we are all hoping that the levels will be sustained in subsequent years when we have wetter conditions.
Okay, but we wouldn't
So,
have to say, oh, it's super hot, we need to raise the trigger levels to make more water for the trees.
I don't anticipate that, no.
Okay.
But
So Tom, let me add to what you just said. Yeah. So DWR has made it clear that and the undesirable result, which is say a die-off, has to be a result of either groundwater pumping or an action described in the GSP or implemented by the GSA. Otherwise, in fact, that evaluation occurs. We'll have that written into the GSP as far as what our evaluation process will involve and what actions might be taken if, in fact, we find that through that evaluation process that it was caused by pumping or some action through implementation of a project or program in the GSP. And as Tom already said, the GSA can't be responsible for drought conditions or some other climatic driven thing or land use driven issue.
Tara, do you have other questions from the public that have been submitted?
I do.
Okay.
So moving into, were there considerations into setting the trigger level to be at a point a bit above the low management trigger level so that decision makers may know ahead of time if the levels are approaching the low management trigger level? If management decisions are made when the low management trigger level is reached, there's a possibility that beneficial uses may already be stressed or impacted. Rather, if a management decision is made in advance, perhaps that would allow time for implementation of measures to avoid the low management trigger level.
I think that's a great comment. And I think the consideration has been talked about and thought through. The concept of a yellow warning level has been talked about. We haven't adopted that or recommended that at this point. I think there might be some points in particular that are maybe our priority locations that might be more susceptible to the timeliness of the response. But at this point, the plan doesn't suggest that. But it's a good comment, and I think the team should consider not I don't think pervasively, but maybe in particular spots it might make sense.
Does that answer your question? Feel free to chat or speak.
It does. Thank you.
Great. Those are all my chat questions. So back to Sandra with her hand raised.
Well, do we have, I think before we go back to the committee, I think we're still in public comment.
Got
We'll
it.
certainly come back to other committee members. So Sandra, we'll come right back to you. Are there any other public comments? Let us know and we'll recognize you for 3 minutes. Hearing or seeing no one, I think we've concluded public comment on this. Sandra, go ahead.
Hi. So, Tom, it sounded like you were sort of bifurcating surface water and groundwater. And we all know that the amount of water that hits the ground in the form of rain becomes surface water, and that surface water's infiltration becomes the groundwater. So we should be concerned with surface water and stopping the rush to the sea of stormwater, and stop the not just rampant over pumping, but we already have, like I said, the Atlantis and the Arundo, among others, that are actually stealing the water that would otherwise infiltrate into the ground and become our groundwater. And I really think that the GSA should be, once again, concerned with the surface water and slowing down our creeks, slowing down, eliminating as much of the invasive species that suck our water as we can. And also, we should still be thinking of infiltration projects on the east side. Mr. Mesnada, they do not have to be up on a hill. They can be at the lower part of a canyon or the lower part. Like for example, the infiltration at the new activity center is at a lower point, but it is on the east side. And that's the type of stuff that we should be advocating and looking at to help improve our groundwater.
Hey, Eric, just a quick response. Sandra, I'm not talking about on top of the hill. I think staff could address it for you. I'm talking about, when I say a steep gradient, I'm talking about a steep gradient in the river, in the creek. But that's probably a technical discussion for another day so that staff can explain it to you, because ultimately remedies on the east end could involve removing redunda, like you said, if there is any up there, and then just managing groundwater pumping to the extent it needs to be managed, at least in my opinion. But once again, those approaches that you're suggesting would be appropriate for staff to address and explain to you whether or not it makes sense, because some of the stormwater projects that were reviewed by the county further to the west end result in costs of up to $2,000, if not more, up to even more than $2,000 per acre foot, which is the equivalent of desalinating water. So representing the public, the taxpayers and the ratepayers, I'm sensitive to that particular issue, but there's also technical issues that really trump the financial.
Mr. Mesnada, to answer what you just said, I appreciate the fact that you do have much more experience and knowledge than I do, but there's also nature-based solutions such as bioswales that can slow down rivers and creeks, and that can also add to the infiltration. And I think that those are very cost effective. And I would love to talk with staff more about nature-based solutions.
Sounds like
So
one way
Dan and Sandra.
Staff. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I was simply going to say that this is a very good conversation. We're going to be moving into another phase of the project that you all will be part of, which is called Projects and Management Actions. So we'll be coming up with a list of projects and management actions to deal with particular concerns about undesirable results. We may have some projects and management actions that you all want to put forward that are intended to prevent the possibility of these things or enhance water quality or enhance groundwater recharge, if that is something that the GSA wishes to go forward with. So we will get to that, and there will be some meetings on this topic.
Great. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank
Any
you.
other discussion or comments from the committee before we close this matter? Then I want to thank Rick, Jeff, and Tom for that excellent presentation and for the discussion. That closes item 3.2 on our agenda. Item 4 is a request for future agenda items from the committee. Are there any items that committee members want to suggest for upcoming committee meetings?
Eric, this is Matt.
Go ahead, Matt.
It sounds like we have a couple of open seats on the committee. Can somebody explain to the committee what's going to happen with those open seats?
I attended Monday's meeting. Tara, do you want to, of the full board, Tara, do you want to recap what that discussion was at the GSA level?
Yeah, absolutely. We will be posting the openings to see if we can garner any interest in filling those 2 seats. But we won't be doing it, and then they will be appointed by the board, since we're only a year and like a year and a tiny little bit left in terms of how much time we have left. We're not going to be doing like the full kind of 3-month process to try and vote and all of that again. So it'll just be as quick as we can, and if anyone wants to be part of it. Yes, Dan.
Dan, go ahead.
Just an additional item in regards to the sustainability management criteria going forward. When you distribute when staff distributes the draft, could you also, distribute a clean copy, but also a red line copy, so then we can see what changes are being made over time? Is that possible?
Tara, let me take that. We can, I'm not sure we're going to do that on this round. We can try. The draft that's going to be coming out is going to be quite a bit longer than what's in your staff report. But to answer your question, yes, we can look to highlight the changes from what we've already presented to you. So.
Thanks. And I'm not trying to go back in time, just moving forward to the extent that that's doable. Thanks.
Okay.
Anything else? Tara, any other comments you've received?
I have no other comments in chat. Thank you.
I think we are concluded. Thank you all for your participation today. Steve, you have a comment. Oh, you're waving. Okay, Steve, just waving goodbye. Thank you all for being here. We'll adjourn. We'll see you next time.
Have a good evening.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.